Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
The coffee cup slipped in that lazy, careless way that made it obvious he wasn't really sorry. One moment I was typing, finally getting into a rhythm after hours of piecing through the most intricate sections of the file I'd spent over 3 years building. And the next, the dark splash of lukewarm bitterness was sliding across the keyboard of my laptop like a slow, sticky death. It didn't spill accidentally, not the way you'd expect from someone bumping into a table or knocking over their drink in a rush. No, it was the kind of spill that happens when someone waves their arm too close to your workspace while cracking a joke, not paying attention, and then doesn't bother apologizing because, well, it's you, he laughed. Actually laughed, like we were in the middle of a sitcom, and I was supposed to groan and swat his shoulder and then order another coffee. Instead, I just sat there, watching the amber puddle slide under the keys as the screen flickered once, then twice, then went black. My breath caught in my chest, not because I was panicking, but because I was waiting for him to realize what he'd just done. But of course, he didn't. Relax, Ethan said, shrugging one shoulder as he leaned back against the kitchen counter, sipping from his own untouched cup. It's not like you do anything important on that thing, right? I turned to look at him. My younger brother, the golden child of our family, the one who could do no wrong even when he was wrong. 6 ways from Sunday, and I felt something twist in my chest, not pain, not even anger really, but a kind of cold acknowledgement. That moment was a perfect distillation of our entire relationship. He made the mess, I paid the price, and he never even saw it. The thing about Ethan is, he never took me seriously. Not when we were kids, not when we were adults, not even now, with him approaching 50 and still calling me kiddo, like I was 12 instead of 48. He had this way of brushing off anything I did or said with a joke, a wink, or a dismissive laugh, like the very idea of me being competent or serious was something inherently funny to him. Meanwhile, he ran around bragging about his business ventures, his investment properties, and his so-called philanthropy work, while carefully ignoring the trail of quietly destroyed relationships and questionable accounting decisions he left in his wake. But in that moment, as he stood there smirking like a school bully who just flicked a paper ball at someone too tired to fight back, I didn't yell, I didn't curse, I didn't even reach for paper towels. Instead, I calmly picked up the laptop, still warm and dripping from the inside, and placed it on the counter beside him. The screen was completely dead, but I didn't need it anymore. I had already seen what I needed to see, and more importantly, he hadn't. Then I did something that surprised even me. I reached for my phone, unlocked it, and tapped into my cloud sync. One click, and the screen loaded a preview of the last document I had opened. It took him a second to realize what he was looking at. A spreadsheet. Boring, right? Just lines of names, dates, numbers, codes. His smirk barely twitched. Until I scrolled. Slowly, deliberately, line by line. Offshore transfer, vendor match, duplicate invoice, non-profit expense misallocation. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of silence that sounds like a room being vacuum sealed, like the oxygen has been quietly siphoned out of the space between two people. His eyes stayed on the screen, and I watched the color drain from his face, the slow, blooming awareness creeping over his expression like mold spreading on bread. Ugly, sudden, unavoidable. What is this?" he asked, his voice catching slightly. I smiled, not smug, not mean, just calm, controlled. The kind of smile a woman gives after years of biting her tongue, years of watching someone else get away with everything because no one else was willing to do the hard work of pulling back the curtain. "You probably should have checked what you just ruined," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. "That laptop? It was just the local copy." I turned the screen around, locked it, and set it face down on the table. He didn't move, didn't blink. I could tell his brain was scrambling, rewinding through the last few years, trying to remember exactly what he'd told me, what he'd let me see, what careless slips he'd made at Thanksgiving, or during those late-night calls where he thought I was just being the supportive sister, the one who never understood money or power or how the world really worked. But I understood more than he ever gave me credit for. I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on a napkin, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. He didn't follow. He didn't even call after me. And that was the most satisfying part. Because for the first time in our lives, he knew, really knew, that I wasn't the little sister playing in the background of his main character fantasy. I had been watching, listening, saving, not out of spite, out of strategy. And now the game was starting, but the rules, they were mine. After Ethan left that afternoon, rattled and visibly pale beneath his tan and bravado, I stood in the hallway with my arms crossed, listening to the silence settle behind the closed door like dust in a room no one had disturbed for a very long time. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, taking slow breaths and letting the weight of what I'd done sink in. Not because I regretted it, but because I wanted to make sure I was still standing on the right side of control. What I had shown him wasn't even a tenth of what I had gathered. What was on that screen, those lines and codes and transfers, was barely the prologue to the full story I had been quietly collecting for the past 3 years. A story I never intended to tell, unless he gave me a reason. And now, he had given me the best reason of all. It had started small, almost forgettable, the way most big things do. I was helping Ethan with his taxes 3 years ago. Not because he asked me, of course he didn't ask, but because he had fumbled through dinner one night talking about how ridiculous it was to hire a second accountant just for a side nonprofit. He laughed, said he didn't even understand what half the forms meant, and then casually dropped a binder on my lap like it was a tray of cookies I should feel lucky to have. I hadn't seen the warning sign then, but the moment I opened those pages and looked at the returns, the numbers practically screamed for attention. Things didn't match. Donations didn't align with bank statements. There were vendor invoices listed with no names, only generic codes and addresses that traced back to empty lots. I didn't say anything at the time. I just flipped through the pages, nodding while my mind spun quietly beneath the surface, already taking mental snapshots. That night, I started the file. I named it Insurance because I didn't know what else to call it at the time. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It wasn't even a threat. It was a safety net, a quiet record of details no one else was paying attention to. And it grew slowly at first. One email here, a forwarded invoice there, then faster, like a snowball gaining speed on a downhill slope. I wasn't a hacker. I didn't dig into private accounts or install spyware. I just listened, watched, paid attention. Ethan, for all his arrogance, was careless with details, and even more careless with people. He talked too much when he drank. He left documents open on shared computers. He trusted that no one in the room was smart enough or bold enough to notice what he was doing. Especially not me, but I noticed everything. The file eventually grew into a full digital archive, categorized by year, by project, by fake charity initiative. There were screenshots of financial records, email trails, and correspondence with shell companies that were little more than post office boxes in states no one lived in. Every so-called philanthropic event had a trail, payments to friends, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and mysteriously disappearing funds from the nonprofit accounts. He wasn't just sloppy, he was brazen. Because when you're the kind of man Ethan is, charming, loud, always the center of the room, you stop believing consequences apply to you. You start to think you're immune to exposure. The deeper I went, the less shocked I became. It wasn't that Ethan was some criminal mastermind. Far from it. He wasn't even creative in his corruption. He was just ordinary in his greed. The kind of man who reads headlines about high-profile fraud cases and thinks, they just got unlucky. He always had a fallback excuse, always a new scapegoat or story. The file became my anchor, a way to steady myself when he made me feel invisible again. When he interrupted me, dismissed my ideas, or laughed when I mentioned I was working on something private, I'd go home, open the folder, and remind myself, I'm not crazy. I see what I see. After the laptop incident, I backed everything up twice. Once to an encrypted drive I stored in my safe deposit box at the credit union, and once to a secure cloud server with no identifiable name. Just a long, meaningless string of numbers only I had the key for. I knew in the back of my mind that things would escalate. Men like Ethan don't just walk away from moments like that. They come back louder, angrier, more desperate. But I didn't flinch. I welcomed it because this time I wasn't scrambling to catch up. I was steps ahead. The next morning, I received an email from Ethan's assistant. She said he wanted to clarify things and maybe grab lunch to catch up. I didn't respond. I forwarded the message to a separate folder marked Post-Event Contact. A few hours later, another message came through, this one more direct. I think you misunderstood what you saw. Let's talk. No drama. That was the moment I realized he still didn't understand what he was dealing with. He thought this was a misunderstanding, that I had stumbled across something too big for my small brain, that I'd panic and hand it all over in exchange for some vague apology or maybe even a thinly veiled threat. But I wasn't scared. I was methodical, and I wasn't going to hand anything over. I clicked open the backup file, scrolled through the pages, and opened a section labeled Board Contacts. Because I hadn't just collected evidence. I'd identified who needed to see it, who could be trusted, who had already started whispering behind closed doors. There were cracks in Ethan's empire. I hadn't made them, but I knew exactly where to press. And I was done pressing softly. The invitation came in the usual way. A cheery text from our sister Beth, followed by a group message filled with passive-aggressive emojis, and a link to a Google Sheet where we were all expected to sign up for dishes. I stared at my phone for a long minute before answering, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I already knew that no matter how I responded, I would be walking into a carefully staged performance. Ethan would be there. That was the point. Beth always happened to plan these things when he was in town, and despite pretending not to take sides, she made sure everyone understood that her goal was to keep things normal, which really meant keeping Ethan comfortable. Still, I replied with a simple, "I'll bring dessert," because sometimes showing up is more powerful than staying away. Especially when you're sitting on a truth that could blow the room apart. The dinner itself was as rehearsed as a community theater production, right down to the tension beneath the smiles and the obligatory compliments about Beth's decorating. She'd gone with a cozy, rustic theme. Little pumpkins scattered across the table, cloth napkins tied with twine, that sort of thing. And everyone was dressed like they were being filmed for a Thanksgiving commercial. I arrived on time, carrying a homemade apple tart that I had no intention of eating, and was immediately met with the usual chorus of greetings that managed to sound cheerful and condescending all at once. Ethan, predictably, was already holding court at the end of the table, leaning back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, telling a story about a business trip that involved a yacht, a malfunctioning espresso machine, and some minor celebrity I barely recognized. He saw me walk in and flash that smile he'd perfected over the years. The one that said, "I see you, but I'm not really looking." He raised his glass in a half-toast, didn't bother standing, and went right back to his story. As if I'd just delivered a pizza, instead of showing up to a family gathering with enough ammunition to end his entire career. I set the tart down, greeted Beth and the others, and took a seat at the far end of the table, directly across from Ethan's wife, Lauren. Her smile was tight, eyes too wide, the way women smile when they've had to get very good at hiding things they're not allowed to say out loud. Dinner was the usual mix of small talk and subtle landmines. Beth asked about my freelance work with a tone that suggested she didn't really believe I did anything. One of Ethan's sons asked if I was still living in that little place near the train tracks, and everyone laughed like it was a harmless joke. Ethan, of course, took the opportunity to lean back and say, "Hey, it's cozy and Rachel likes simple things, right?" Like I was a thrift store mascot. I didn't bite. I just smiled and sipped my wine. I was biding time. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth had already started shifting in the shadows, and soon it would come into the light. It was during dessert that the conversation shifted in a way that made the air feel suddenly heavier. Lauren asked Ethan, in a tone that was too casual to be truly innocent, "Did you ever figure out what happened with that invoice issue at the foundation?" The room went still for a moment, like the sound had been sucked out of it. Ethan gave her a quick look, sharp, warning, familiar, then laughed it off and said something about a clerical error. Promised it had been handled. But I saw the way her fingers tightened on her fork, the way her eyes didn't leave him. She was asking for more than just curiosity's sake. She already knew something wasn't right. She just didn't know how deep the rot went. After dinner, while the others cleared plates and Ethan held court again in the living room, Lauren followed me into the kitchen. She didn't speak right away. She just stood next to me at the sink, drying the plates I rinsed. Both of us moving in silence like two women who had been trapped in the same story, but on different pages. Then very quietly, she said, "I saw something on our joint account. A withdrawal for $43,000, marked as a consulting fee, but the name listed wasn't real. I checked." I kept my eyes on the plate in my hands, rinsed it, passed it to her. "I know," I said softly. She turned to look at me then, eyes wide. "You know?" Her voice cracked just slightly, not with emotion, but with the relief that someone else had seen it too, the thing she'd been gaslit into questioning. I nodded, set the plate down, and reached into my bag. I didn't hand her the entire file, just a single printed sheet, one page from the folder titled Payments, showing her husband's name next to a list of disbursements from the nonprofit's account to various shell vendors, all cross-referenced with dates, locations, and corresponding email threads I'd recovered from his unprotected backups. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I let the paper speak for itself. Lauren stared at it, silent. Then she folded it in half and slid it into her purse without another word. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. "Long enough," I replied. We didn't say goodbye when I left. I slipped out while Ethan was still laughing about something on his phone, while the others were discussing the best pie crust techniques and debating whether the dog needed a sweater. The hallway outside was cold, the wind sharp, but it felt cleaner out there, like I'd walked out of a lie and back into a world that made sense. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. Because the file was no longer just mine, and Ethan had just lost the one person who might have helped him keep the lie going. And that was only the beginning. The message was short, clipped, and typed in a rush, as if someone had realized too late that the fire had already started and was now scrambling to contain the smoke. "We need to talk," it read. No punctuation, no pleasantries, just 4 flat words that barely concealed the panic underneath. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone down without answering. I had no intention of replying, not immediately, not impulsively, and definitely not while he still thought he was in control of this unraveling. Because Ethan, for all his smooth-talking, deal-making, speech-giving bravado, had finally stepped into something bigger than him, and now he had no idea how to walk his way out of it. The day after the family dinner, I hadn't gone home right away. Instead, I drove to the small bank 2 towns over, the one with the outdated carpet and slow-talking tellers, and opened the safety deposit box I'd paid for in cash 6 months prior. Inside was a single USB drive, nestled in a padded envelope, along with a list of names I'd printed on archival grade paper, names of board members, names of clients, names of people who, whether by accident or design, had accepted Ethan's word as gospel. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust, reputation, legacy, and the slow, silent poison of unchecked arrogance. That night, I sent a message to one of those names. Just one, a soft contact. Not a direct accusation, not a demand or a threat, but a careful nudge. "You may want to review the last set of reports tied to the Clearwater Fund," I wrote. "Look especially at the disbursements in Q3. A full audit may be warranted." I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The recipient was sharp enough to recognize the red flags buried in that sentence. And if he followed them, he'd find more, much more. That was the plan. What Ethan didn't understand was that I wasn't just holding files. I was holding a fuse, and I had already lit the match. 2 days passed. No more calls, no more texts, just silence. And then, at exactly 11:23 on a Thursday morning, I received a voicemail from a blocked number. The voice was male, soft-spoken, professional. He didn't introduce himself by name. He simply said, "I believe we have mutual concerns. I used to work for him, too. I signed things I didn't understand. Things I'm not proud of. I heard what you're doing. If you're serious about taking it further, I'll go with you." Then he gave me a number and hung up. I listened to the message 3 times. The tone was steady, but there was a weariness beneath it. The kind of exhaustion that only comes from years of biting your tongue while someone else spins lies in broad daylight. I called him back that afternoon. We didn't meet in person. Everything was handled through encrypted apps, careful wording, and neutral locations. He sent me scanned documents, old contracts, internal memos, altered financial statements, things that matched what I already had, and more importantly, things I hadn't seen before. He'd been a mid-level manager at one of Ethan's shell companies, listed on paper as a consultant, but in practice little more than a proxy. When the company had dissolved, he'd been handed a silence agreement and a check. But money doesn't always buy peace. The wire came later that week, not from Ethan, but from one of his organizations, a fund that had long been praised in press releases for its community outreach. $47,000 moved overnight from an account under Ethan's name to a new vendor, a vendor that didn't exist. I caught it by accident, combing through the backups while cataloging data for my report. It was too clean, too fast. It was panic money, money on the move. It told me he had found the loose thread and was trying to sew the hole shut before the curtain came down. I took a deep breath, saved the evidence, and sent a second message. This time to a board member whose name appeared on 3 years' worth of meeting minutes, but whose signature never appeared on any of the wire approvals. It was a calculated move. I chose someone who wasn't involved but would be furious about being lied to. I knew this man. I'd met him once at a family function. He was methodical, he was sharp, he didn't like being played. I attached one document, just one, a wire transfer summary with a note at the bottom that read, "Authorized by Ethan Langley, no matching board vote found." The response came within hours. "We'll be investigating this internally. Thank you for bringing it to our attention." No name, no small talk, just formal fire. When the call from Ethan finally came, it wasn't angry, it wasn't loud, it was quiet, measured, dangerous, that kind of too calm tone that people use when they think they're still in the game, but they've started to feel the floor shift under their feet. He said my name 3 times before I spoke. "Rachel," he said, "I just want to understand what you think you're doing, not what I was doing, what I thought I was doing." As if this was all some misunderstanding. As if he could still talk me out of it, charm me, manipulate me into stepping back from the ledge. I told him very plainly, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just sharing what you already did." He didn't respond at first. Then he asked, "What do you want?" I didn't answer, because that was the problem, wasn't it? I didn't want anything from him anymore, and that terrified him more than any evidence ever could. There are moments in life that don't seem important when they happen. Moments so quiet, so ordinary, that you don't realize until much later that they were the axis everything turned on. For years, I had underestimated the weight of those tiny, dismissive moments. The way Ethan talked over me during family dinners, the smirks when I mentioned my freelance work, the jokes about how I still used coupons or drove a car older than his marriage. Each one had chipped away at something inside me, a slow, subtle erosion of dignity that I had internalized for far too long. But in the end, it wasn't one of those big, humiliating blows that changed everything. It was coffee. 1 cup of coffee, spilled across my laptop with a lazy shrug and a cruel smile, followed by 7 careless words. "It's not like you do anything important." He had no idea what I'd built. No idea what he'd just destroyed, or so he thought. In the days that followed, Ethan must have realized that the ground beneath him had begun to shift in ways he couldn't control. The silence between us didn't just widen, it deepened. He stopped calling. The usual flurry of texts slowed, then stopped altogether. I heard through Beth that he was going through something at work, and even she, always his defender, sounded more uncertain than usual. Her voice tinged with something like confusion or maybe fear. People were beginning to talk. Nothing loud, nothing public, just whispers in hallways and glances across conference tables. The kind of whispers that make men like Ethan squirm because they know how much of their power depends on perception. I wasn't out to destroy him, not at first. I hadn't built the file to burn his life down, but to protect mine, to hold in my hands something that proved I wasn't crazy, that the things I'd seen, heard, and felt weren't just fragments of paranoia. But once I started uncovering the truth, once I realized how deep his deception ran, not just petty fraud, not just financial trickery, but real harm to real people, I knew silence wasn't protection anymore. It was complicity. Still, I didn't take it to the press. I didn't run to social media or hold some self-righteous press conference. What I did was quieter and far more devastating. I compiled the evidence, all of it, every line, every wire transfer, every altered document, every fabricated invoice, and I printed a hard copy. It filled a manila folder 2 inches thick. Then I sealed it in a plain envelope, attached a short, unsigned letter, and delivered it directly to the legal counsel for the board, overseeing the nonprofit Ethan had siphoned from for years. No name, no explanation, just facts. Cold, inarguable facts. The fallout wasn't instant, and I hadn't expected it to be. These things don't explode, they unravel. The first tug on the thread came in the form of a formal audit announcement, buried deep in a newsletter to stakeholders. Then came the board reshuffling, the sudden silence on Ethan's once active social media accounts, the cancellation of a gala he'd been planning for months. I watched from the sidelines, not with glee, not even with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet inevitability. The truth doesn't always roar when it comes out. Sometimes it just seeps, steadily and unstoppably, through the cracks they thought they'd sealed shut. Lauren filed for separation shortly after. She didn't call me. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any phone call ever could. She'd seen the evidence. She knew it had been done in her name. And she wasn't going to be dragged down with him. The last time I saw Ethan, it wasn't in a courtroom or at a hearing, and it certainly wasn't during some tearful confrontation. It was at Beth's house, 2 months after everything had started to fall apart, during a stiff little brunch that no one wanted to attend, but no one could quite cancel. He looked older, not dramatically so, but in that way people do when their invincibility has finally been questioned. His eyes darted toward me several times, but he never spoke. He didn't have to. Every glance was a question he was too afraid to ask. What else do you have? Who else did you tell? Why didn't you stop? And the answer, though I never said it aloud, lived in the silence between us. Because it was never about revenge. Not really. It was about agency. It was about remembering that I had the power to say no, to stop cleaning up someone else's messes, to stop letting someone else define my worth by how little I demanded in return for my loyalty. He had assumed I was harmless. He had assumed that my silence was weakness, that my quietness was submission. But the truth was, I had been watching, I had been learning, and I had been documenting everything, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I refused to be hurt by him anymore. That coffee, that one careless act, was never just coffee. It was the final moment in a long line of moments, the final insult in a decade of dismissals, the final drop in a cup that had been full for years. And when it spilled, it didn't ruin me. It woke me up. Now, whenever people ask me what changed, I tell them the truth, not the long version, not the whole backstory, just the simple truth. He should have never spilled that coffee, and he definitely should have never assumed I wasn't important.